In Unit 2, Lesson 2, Exploration 1, we're going to look at the properties of carbon. Carbon is an incredibly important molecule in living organisms. It's basically the most common molecule in all living organisms. Now, when we talk about the chemistry of these living organisms, we call it organic chemistry. And it's because almost all of the chemical reactions that take place in living things have to deal with carbon. All right, now, in these organic molecules, there are lots of different types of compounds that exist, but they're basically broken down into 4 categories. And those 4 categories are right here: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, we'll talk more about those 4 specifically in another exploration, but I wanted to introduce them to you right now by the name that we're going to call them, which is macromolecules. Okay, these were what we call organic macromolecules. Organic means that they are living. Macro basically just means large, because all of these molecules are fairly large in size. All right. Now, the structure of carbon-based molecules is unique because of this fact that carbon has 4 available electrons that can bond. We talked earlier about how molecules are always looking to fill up their outer shell. Well, carbon has 4 out of 8, which means they are just as likely to gain 4 electrons as they are to lose 4 electrons. Now, when we look at these specific types of molecules, the carbon atoms that are forming are most likely to bond with hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And the combination of those 5 elements is going to make up almost every single structure found in a living organism. Now, there's a couple of different shapes that we'll see. So I'm going to start with this one right here. When we study organic molecules, they're pretty much going to fall into one of these following shapes. The first shape is a straight chain, and we call it that because all of the carbons, as you see here, are lined up in one straight chain. Now, off of that, you'll see hydrogens, you'll see oxygens, you might even see other types of elements, but they're all going to branch off of this original straight chain. Okay? An example of this is a fatty acid. So like a lipid would look like this. Okay, this is what your cell membrane looks like, for what it's worth. It's a combination of these types of carbon atoms linked together. The next one is called a branched chain. All right, and a branched chain is where you'll see that the carbons are still linked up in a line, but off of that main line is another carbon atom. Now, this can get some different shapes involved. And sometimes this is what we see with proteins, because a lot of those proteins are involved in creating specific 3-dimensional shapes like enzymes, like we talked about last week. And then a third type of shape for these organic molecules is a ring. In this shape, we can see our carbon atoms right here make up this ring structure. All right, and this is what we'll see when we look at a lot of sugars. A lot of carbohydrates have this ring-shaped structure. Sometimes there's 5 carbons involved, sometimes there's 6, but they're always going to link up to form this ring structure. Okay. Now, like I said earlier, carbons have 4 available bonds. So they don't always just bond with one atom like a hydrogen. It's possible for a carbon to bond twice with the same element. Like in this case, carbon is going to form 2 bonds with the same oxygen. Might even have a triple bond here. Now, when you get a triple bond, it starts to change the shape a little bit, but we're not going to go too much into that right now. The key is that you can see that off of this carbon atom, there are 4 total bonds. Off of this carbon atom, there are 4 total bonds that form. All right, now let's talk about monomers and polymers. All of the organic molecules that we're going to study are called polymers because they are all going to be a chain-like structure. And if you know what a chain looks like, you know that a chain is made up of chain links. So the polymer would represent the larger overall molecule that is made up of smaller versions of that molecule that we call monomers. Poly means many, mono means one. All right. Now there's a couple of characteristics about carbon molecules that allow them to form these structures. First of all, carbon can bond with itself or with other atoms. Now that gives it a lot of flexibility with how it chooses to react with other elements. We talked about this earlier, but carbon also can form many different shapes. They can form rings, they can form chains, they can form lots of different types of shapes, which again gives it the flexibility to bond with a lot of different types of elements. And finally, carbon is very often likely to bond with hydrogen atoms. It's a very good match for a hydrogen and a carbon to bond with each other. And so when we have a molecule with a lot of carbons and hydrogens, we call those hydrocarbons, which makes sense. They're made of hydrogens and carbons. All right, and these types of molecules contain a ton of energy. All right. Now here's an example of kind of what we're looking at here. So if you're looking at a stalk of celery, okay, that celery is going to be made up of carbohydrates, which are chains of sugars put together. Now, as we talked about earlier, a lot of those sugars have a ring-shaped structure. So we take one of those rings, we attach it to another ring, we attach it to another ring, and we put all of those together until we form this structure that we call, in this case, cellulose. All right. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in this lesson is something called an isomer. And we're not going to talk a lot about isomers other than the fact that I want to show you something for when we get to our photosynthesis lesson later. These ring-shaped structures, like I said earlier, can have a couple of different shapes. They can have 6 sides or they can have 5 sides. They're going to contain the same number of atoms. I want you to see down here, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. Same thing over here. But they're oriented in a different fashion to give them different properties. So that's what we call an isomer, where they have the same number of atoms, but they're arranged in different ways to give them a slightly different function. All right. Okay. So that's it for this particular exploration. We'll check in next time when we want to talk about the structure and the function of these 4 different types of carbon-based molecules.